Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, remember, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. In the fall of 2008, equity markets were in free fall. The Dow Jones Industrial, S&P 500, and Nasdaq were all on their way towards lows not seen since the mid-1990s. Stock valuations would collapse by more than 50%. Legacy investment banks filed for bankruptcy, while others fled into the rapacious arms of their competitors or under the protection of Congress and the Federal Reserve. At the same time as Schumpeter's ghost was rattling his chains on Wall Street, Satoshi's white paper was making the rounds on a cryptography mailing list in some obscure corner of the internet. I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party, he wrote, directing the several hundred recipients to his paper, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Merchants must be wary of their customers, he writes. A certain percentage of fraud is accepted as unavoidable, but these costs and payment uncertainties can be avoided in person by using physical currency. But no mechanism exists to make payments over a communications channel without a trusted party. This last bit was only partly true. It was Satoshi's paper, after all, that made it untrue. Though few realized it at the time, the Bitcoin white paper marked the beginning of the Internet's second act. In the 10 years since its publication, we have seen an eruption of interest, development, and investment in protocols built from Satoshi's underlying blockchain technology, designed to execute commands across a distributed, trustless network of computers. Ethereum led the way with its pioneering virtual machine, able to execute smart contracts across a permissionless network, and since several competing ledgers have cropped up, each claiming some advancement over prior versions. But what if, in their bid to create a faster horse, developers and investors alike have missed a crucial turning point in the evolution of the Internet? Satoshi's white paper, brilliant as it was, never claimed to be the blueprint for a world computer. As the Bitcoin network has grown, so too have the costs of its transactions, and this is because adding blocks takes time. Deciding what chain to build on requires the network to agree on which chain is the longest, and when chains are growing too fast, it's hard to tell the difference. In the last several years, we've seen an explosion of brainpower devoted towards creating workarounds to the scalability problem, but we've also seen a quiet, committed effort at building alternatives that aren't saddled with blockchain's limitations. Perhaps the most interesting of these alternatives is Hashgraph. Built as a directed acyclic graph, its fundamental innovation is not in its architecture, but in its consensus. To the uninitiated, its technology can often seem like magic. One might describe its consensus protocol as nothing more than a compression algorithm for the casting of votes. A voting algorithm for a global network. What would have once taken an impossible amount of time can now be accomplished in a matter of seconds. It was Claude Shannon, the father of information theory, who stated it most clearly. The fundamental problem of communication is that of reproducing at one point, either exactly or approximately, a message created at another. In its first iteration, the Internet solved the problem of communication across a network without the need for a trusted third party. But making definitive statements about that communication has always required an intermediary. In order to harness the full power of the Internet, we need to do for data processing, computation, and storage what the existing suite of Internet protocols have already done for communication. A revolution for a new generation, the Internet's second act. This week on Hidden Forces, Tom Trowbridge, Hashgraph, and the second Internet revolution. So, Tom Trowbridge, welcome to Hidden Forces.
Thanks so much for having me.
So it's Trowbridge, not Trowbridge, right?
Correct.
Because I always want to call you Tom Trowbridge because it sounds like a Western, like a name from a guy like coming in, a gunslinger from the West.
You wouldn't be the first to make that mistake.
So now I've completed the circle now. I've had Mance, well, Mance was on a panel, and I've had Lehman, obviously, a bunch of times, and now I've had you, so I've completed the Hedera Hashgraph circle.
Exactly. It's great to be here, and we appreciate the support.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it also that you came. I mean, this was a opportunity that came out of a few last-minute cancellations of some guests that we're going to have on in the future, but it was fortuitous because you have some great news to share with our audience, and that has to do with the crowd sale that you're doing, accredited crowd sale. But before we talk about that, two things I want to mention. For those who don't know, I'm actually an investor in Hedera. We covered Hedera a long while ago. I actually hope that listeners who aren't aware of that because they haven't heard those episodes on Hashgraph or Hedera Hashgraph, I hope they aren't aware of that because then it means I'm doing my job right, which is covering the space as objectively as I possibly can. And we're going to try to do that today also. And another thing I want to say is that nothing we have to say here today is investment advice. It should be construed as investment advice in no way whatsoever. I mean, for you, that's fine. I'm saying for me is what I mean. So, Tom, first of all, I want to talk about this industry more broadly with you because you have an interesting perspective. I mean, Lehman's the super technical guy. Mance is obviously no shrinking wallflower when it comes to technical stuff. And your background is different, and I feel like you have a more layman's ability to explain this information. And you do a lot of the, I guess, business development and sales work all around the world for Hashgraph. What is the latest on what Hashgraph is doing?
The exciting part is that we launched our accredited investor crowd sale. And so August 1st, we launched that at 8 a.m. In 24 hours, we've had just about 3,000 people register to participate, which is really, exciting. It happened so quickly. We're just using it based on our own lists. We have a provider who's helping us, TokenSoft's helping us go through the AML KYC, but it's just people who've registered on our site and it's our community. So it's great to see that level of involvement so quickly. People are going through the process right now and investing, and we think that shows the support of the community, which is something that has been important for us from the very beginning.
That just made me remember what it was like when you guys kind of blew up and people started learning about you and everyone was upset that there was no ICO. Remember that? Yeah. And it's funny because that was in the early days where there really wasn't an awareness about the way in which companies in this space were shifting their strategy and they were becoming aware and concerned about regulations. And now it's just every sort of interesting company has either a SAFT or some other type of accredited investor arrangement. Can you talk a little bit about that? What's that been like? I mean, how have you guys navigated the regulatory space?
It's been an evolution. And I think we're based in the U.S. We are predominantly U.S. citizens. A lot of our governing members are going to be U.S. companies. A lot of dApps are based in the U.S. So it's very important for us that we are highly aware of and follow and adhere to the U.S. regulatory regime. And that's disappointing to a lot of people overseas, and even people in the U.S. is disappointing too sometimes. But that's the reality of the world we live in. And we're doing everything to be as compliant as we possibly can. And even understanding what's compliant isn't always crystal clear, as I think you've recognized in some of your previous shows. But we've engaged with regulators. We continue to engage with regulators. And, part of the reason we've done this sale now, as opposed to later, is that we want to launch the network pretty soon. And we don't think we can actually have an active SAFT after we've launched the network.
Why is that?
And it has to do with how the SAFT would be characterized, because the SAFT is a security. And we don't want to be offering that when we actually have a token live and the network actually operating.
I've looked at a lot of companies in this space and looked at them as an investor as well. And I would say you guys are at the very top in terms of, from the very beginning, being extra concerned about regulation. Extra concerned.
I mean, I think that's the case. It comes,
Why, though? What made you so, I'm not saying it's not smart, but what made you so concerned about that?
I guess it comes from the top. Both Mance and Lehman, are both ex-military and are highly focused on following the rules and doing the right thing and acting in the most conservative way possible. And I think that is just driven everything we've done at the company. It's also made life harder for us. When we raised money from institutions, we didn't take money from jurisdictions where we felt regulation wasn't clear that we could do so. And that
What's an
included
example?
like Japan, China, Russia. So the
Wow.
money we've raised, we took no money from any of those areas.
You took no money from China?
Nope. And we also didn't take syndicates. We actually refunded syndicates and shut 7 unauthorized syndicates down. So the fact we raised this $100 million without those markets is remarkable, I think is missed. And in this sale, which is something we have to, we're getting some heat in the community for, but not only is it accredited investors, but we decided to hold all investors to U.S. accreditation standards, which is not something typically done either. And that's actually enormously complicates it, but we think there are very valid reasons for doing that, which will become apparent kind of further down the road. But, we have a long game here, thinking about this from another perspective. Almost 2/3 of Lehman and Mantz's tokens don't vest until years 4, 5, and 6. Almost all of management tokens vest over a 4-year period. So this is a very long duration project, and we are investing our time, effort, energy, and building a company for that duration. And so there isn't an interest in a short-term sacrifice given the long-term horizon we all have.
That's actually also for security reasons as well. I mean, because of the way that you guys are staking tokens and you're securing the network, having a control over the supply schedule of those tokens is essential. That's something that Lehman and I spoke about on episode 36, which was on camera, for those who want to look that up on YouTube.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case. And that comes into the kind of how one thinks about this from an investment side. But we expect to have only about 10% released in the first year, and that goes up to about 1/3 by year 5. And there are circumstances under which that could be somewhat accelerated, but under the current plan, it's 10% in the first year. And I think that is also lost on a lot of people who are used to seeing full supply in the market, or else only look at circulating supply and don't pay attention to the actual total supply. And there are a variety of projects where that difference is huge, and a variety of projects where the difference is 0, and that doesn't seem to be, I'm not sure that's fully appreciated by everybody out there.
It's an interesting point, right? Because the way that people usually think about profiting from the success of a company, that's independent from the company's own success, right? Your ability to monetize your speculation doesn't affect the success of the actual project, but because of the fact that this is a token economy and the staking architecture, releasing those tokens very early can put you at a vulnerable position to be attacked, for example, Sybil attack or something like that.
Certainly. I mean, the way we think about it is that if this were a private permission network, 2/3 of the nodes would generate consensus and with certainty. Ours is token-weighted voting to prevent Sybil attacks, to your point, but 1/3 plus 1 of the tokens in the wrong hands of an attacker could jeopardize consensus. And so our objective is to wait as long as possible until that 1/3 plus is out in the market. And ideally, that is when the tokens have a relatively high value. So it's very difficult to actually buy 1/3 of those tokens and disrupt consensus. And that's why we have a very slow schedule. It's also interesting because that token, unlike a lot of projects, is critical to the security of our network. And so to the extent we have tokens out and people try to corner it or to disrupt consensus by buying 1/3, because it's a fixed supply, the more they buy, we think the price will go up and make it increasingly prohibitively expensive to actually affect that type of attack. And so that is one of the critical reasons why we actually need to have a native token, which isn't the case for every protocol, I would say.
What do you think some of the most challenging technical problems you guys have faced and might face are?
I mean, this is let me phrase it this way. It's incredibly complex to build this. Lehman is best suited to answer that question. But I would just say from looking at other protocols out there and hiccups that have happened, it's pretty clear that this is not a simple thing to build. And you can explain it simply, but getting into the weeds of everything from nodes turning off and joining and falling off the network and how that works is very complex. I think that's something that requires significant development. Sharding is an entirely another area of development which we haven't completed yet. That's in V2. There's a variety of different technical challenges. Luckily, we have Lehman, and Lehman is kind of unparalleled in his ability to architect and then actually implement these solutions.
Again, for listeners who aren't familiar, episode 36, that was essentially a video interview that I did with Lehman at Soho House here in New York. It was the last of 3 interviews I did with him. The first was just on the podcast. The next 2 were video, and the audio was available on the website, at least for 36. In 36, we talked about the public ledger implementation. We hadn't done that before because it didn't exist, or it wasn't something that you guys were talking about openly. We talked about sharding specifically, the challenges normally with sharding a database, particularly a blockchain database, that doesn't have finality, or a blockchain database that doesn't have an implementation of consensus. I spoke about that with Vitalik and Vlad as well, and I do highly suggest anyone who's interested to hear those and to meditate on that, because that is a challenge, sharding a database effectively without finality. Certainly, and then how do you do it with, and how good is your consensus protocol? I want to go back a little bit to this. You guys were talking about the accredited sale. First of all, it sucks that the SEC has those regulations, because you have to do what you have to do, but it totally sucks, and it's unfair, and I totally sympathize and understand why people feel that frustration about that and why they felt it, because it prevents people from investing in things that they'd like, and it gives an advantage to people who have more money to invest, and it's really unfortunate. But the other thing that I've seen that I was concerned about with you guys is the fake companies that have been trying to raise money off of Hedera Hashgraph. That's been going on from the very beginning. Like, initially it was ICOs. Like, people were saying that it's the Hashgraph ICO. How are people doing that right now? Because that's kind of concerning if you're raising money online, right?
It's a huge concern of ours. We have shut down dozens of scam sites, and we continue to do so. One of the reasons that we didn't give any kind of pre-announcements for this crowd sale was to at least mitigate the possibility of the spread of those type of scam sites. It's also why we announced it via video and not via email, and they're telling people to type Hedera Hashgraph or just hashgraph.com into their browser and not click on any links, because there's a number of links out there that you can click on that actually misdirect you. So we've seen scams, and one thing I'd say, the easiest way to tell a scam, and many of these said this, was that it was an ERC20 token. We're not going to be an ERC20 token. So to the extent you see that, that's an easy way to know it's not the case. But listen, I've even had an advisor of ours who was helpful in our capital raising insist with me that he had received a Hashgraph ERC20 token in a wallet of his, and was convinced that we actually had offered and had distributed ERC20 tokens. And this is someone close to the company who didn't believe me when I said it wasn't in fact the case. So they've gotten to that level of sophistication.
That's really upsetting. Not just for you guys. I mean, in general, these scams are becoming more sophisticated, and they target also elderly people.
Yeah. I mean, well, I think in general they do. In this environment, I think in this world, it's probably that may or may not be the case. The other thing that I'd say is we're also going to be recording a video announcement closing the sale, so that people know it is in fact closed, because I think what we're going to see, frankly, are more scams after it's closed for people that have missed it, and then there's a FOMO concept. So I expect to see a lot of scams happen at that point.
Two questions. One, do you know how much has been stolen or scammed from people? Do you have any idea? And two, how are you on top of shutting these sites down, identifying them and shutting them down?
So I don't know how much is stolen. I actually think the dollar numbers are not huge, but it is still something that I know Lehman personally gets involved because he cares so much about it and hates to see money taken from people to support our project. So he's gotten more involved than you would expect. We have a process.
I can imagine Lehman getting involved.
It's definitely the case.
I can imagine him taking moral slight to that.
Oh, for sure. So our counsel's up. We have a variety of providers who are involved and are not only looking for them, and the community is a huge help in sourcing them and kind of identifying these scam sites, but also in helping shut these down. And that involves talking to hosting companies, kind of a whole variety of service providers to get them shut down. But it's a continued whack-a-mole battle.
So this would probably be a good time to go back and learn how you got involved in Hashgraph, and maybe you can start us off with really the beginning of your professional life. Like, I know you went to Yale. You have a great background, Yale. You also did your MBA at Columbia about 10 years after you graduated. And you started at Bear, didn't you?
You
were at Bear when the LTCM bailout happened. When Bear walked out of that meeting?
Yeah, I was there, I was there right before that. I was there 96 to 98. So pre that.
But wasn't it in 98 that they
I guess you're right.
The Fed convened?
I guess you're right. It was right. I think I left
right
before that. Exactly. I was fortunate enough to start at Bear Stearns. I think it was a terrific learning environment because it's incredibly intense and an incredibly flat organization. And so you could get a lot of responsibility as a 21, 22-year-old out of college and work with very senior people across a whole variety of companies. And I started off as an investment banker focused on telecom and technology. And so that was the era of telecom deregulation. And so that was in the CLEX, the DLEX, data providers, cable, everything was growing enormously and a huge amount of financing happening. This sort of telecom access just exploded. And so I was a banker, but focused on rather technology intensive businesses, which was a great training ground for both the financial side, but also the technology side, understanding the difference between CDMA and TDMA and GSM and kind of the very sort of building blocks of telecom infrastructure, which was interesting. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I went and did private equity for 3.5 years in Boston, also focused on telecom and technology. We moved into towers and we did some media as well. And that kind of kept that got me more interested in the investing side of it. And after business school, moved into asset management, was at Goldman for a couple of years and then a variety of hedge funds. But throughout that period, I kept doing seed investing. And so rightly or wrongly, I thought I learned something from the days at Bear Stearns and from the private equity days. And so I, both through business school contacts, but also just people who I'd worked at Bear Stearns with, would see different opportunities from time to time, invested in a handful of them over kind of the past 15 years. And the most recent company I invested in is Swirlds, which is the parent company. And that came about via another deal I was looking at. And a guy who I knew well introduced me to a colleague of his when I was looking at a deal in energy. He then, I understood, knew a great deal about crypto.
And what year was this?
This was in
2014?
No. This was recently. 'Cause I invested in Swirlds in 17, I think it was, early 17.
Wow.
And so he introduced me to, he'd found Swirlds, introduced me to it. I invested in Swirlds, got to know Lehman and Mance through that period. This was before we'd clearly announced any public ledger, but knew that was coming. And after spending more and more time with them and accompanying them on early discussions with some potential council members, I effectively was able to have a introduction to the company and a diligence, have all these big companies diligence.
You'd already invested though.
I'd already invested at the time. But then,
was that part of your strategy to say, this? So before we continue, I'm curious your process here, right? So when you invested in the company, like you said, part of the investment was to get you closer so that you could even make a better assessment about what gave you that insight. Was it mostly the fact that your friend was, you said he was associated with the company, or?
He'd found the white paper and he had a head start on me because of finding it before me and knew the space better than I did, but didn't know it in much more detail.
So what was it, the most compelling thing that got you to invest in the company? Initially, Swirlds.
So this is fascinating, I think, because I also see it from that side, and I see it from all the people I talked to about investing in the company, and all the people who said no and didn't invest in the company.
You and I have talked about this,
and it's such an interesting thing to see both sides of what I saw, and I saw Lehman and Mance as incredibly interesting people with the technology that I couldn't tell if it would win. I didn't know enough to know that, and I still don't. But it seemed like it was a totally different approach that I hadn't seen anywhere else, but I knew I didn't know a lot. So it's not like I bet the farm on it, but it was clearly a technology that was worth an investment because the upside was so significant that if it worked out, it made sense. And the downside's always zero. Like the downside always is everything go to zero. So you have to do a portfolio of these things, which I did. But what was unusual, I think, is not the investment, but the ability to spend more time with the company, being a pretty small investor, and then the fact that they needed to build out a whole team to execute the public ledger plan. And those things worked out together, which was fortuitous.
Really amazing. I had a similar experience insofar as I got to spend a lot of time with Lehman, which gave me a really great insight into the technology. Besides, the initial encounter with the white paper and seeing, and I think similarly it sounds like what you're saying, which is the unique approach and the simplicity of the consensus protocol and the way that it felt very much like a compression algorithm that basically, a compression algorithm for a voting protocol. I actually was having a conversation last night. We were eating I actually wasn't eating. We were at this apparently it was a great Chinese food restaurant with these two brilliant engineers. One who I know, interestingly enough, the other one I knew from a singing class, and I didn't know that they were friends. He's a Facebook engineer. He's an engineer at Facebook. And the other guy also very brilliant, 4 exits. And we were having a sort of philosophical conversation about consensus in general, which is a really interesting thing because there is no, now this is getting a little philosophical, we're going a little off track here, but there's no such thing as objective reality, right? Objective reality is a subjective consensus. It's a consensus around, we come to a communal set of subjective experiences that we share and say this is the objective reality, but we come to them with our own sort of subjective perception. And it's just interesting thinking about what is consensus and sort of why it's so challenging. There's some interesting philosophical questions that arise when I think about it that make sense in the context of the problem anyway, but that's kind of mixing engineering with philosophy. But I mean, that's kind of exciting that you got to be in at the ground floor like that. What skill set did you bring to the table at that time, do you feel like? And it's interesting. It's also cool that you worked with telecommunications technology. I worked for Cablevision for some years, and I found it fascinating because it's this old school legacy stuff, and you have constraints that you don't normally have. What was it that made you sort of uniquely qualified to help the company at that stage?
I guess there's a couple of things. I wouldn't say that I was uniquely qualified. There's probably, a great number of people who could have added value to the company and frankly still can add a lot of value to the company. So I'm not going to claim I was the only person who could have joined at the time. But what did the company need then? It needed someone to help drive the initial conversations with a wide number of the Fortune 100 companies to build the council. And so those are institutions that I'm quite comfortable dealing with from previous roles. And so that was something that I could do quite quickly, although it wasn't originally the plan. Financing was relevant as well. And so that's also something that I'm quite comfortable doing as well. And then we'd hired a general counsel, but legal is a huge part of this whole area, which is also very relevant. And so
That's Natalie,
exactly. And so that was something which also became important. And I just know enough to be dangerous there. I'm not, I have two parents who are lawyers and one of my sisters is, so I'm not a lawyer, but it is just that having that awareness is also positive. And then overlay that with just a different network than Lehman and Mance. And, having been based in Texas primarily, they know a very different group of people than I do. And so I brought a very complementary both skill set as well as network, which I think has been very additive to the business.
You were touching on something before that you and I have talked about, and I'd love to explore it a little bit more before we get to some broader questions about the market, which is how different people confront this technology or see it or relate to it and decide whether they want to invest in it or not, right? You and I have had this conversation before. It's a really fascinating one because you and I, for example, we see something in this that maybe other people don't. Can you elaborate a bit on what that's like for you to see people's approach, why some people decide to invest, why some don't, what the reasons are, and how you explain that?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of expressions that I like. One of my favorite ones, there's two reasons people do something, and the reason they tell you, and then the real reason.
Always.
And so, with something like this, what I have been most surprised about is in a technology and in a world which is so new, the way the kind of strict evaluation of every technology through the existing lens of companies and protocols. And so the lack of interest or understanding in something that's new and different. Mm-hmm. And I saw that again and again where just explaining how it was different than blockchain. Or, I had literally had an investor say, a very well-known group on the West Coast say, we're not bullish on DAGs. And I just, you can't even sort of...
What an odd thing to say.
Right,
that's an odd point. Can you explain to our audience why that's odd? Or I'm happy to...
Well, I mean, a DAG, a directed acyclic graph, they're all different. It's almost like saying you're not bullish on, computers. Like computer is just, it's just a program.
It's the database architecture, which you can have...
anything work on, and you can design it 100 different ways. And so I just found that to just be a very indicative of the lack of understanding of the space. Or their big investors said, you guys don't have as big a community as Ethereum. We'll wait till that happens and look at investing. And kind of say, we haven't even launched our public ledger yet. Of course we don't. If you're a venture investor, you're betting on the technology and the team to get there. It's a whole different game once you actually get there. So there is very specific perceptions of how the world was and that it would stay that way, even though it was so new.
Remarkable.
That's what is so interesting to me. So those are some of the observations that I had.
Well, that was something, I remember this also in my first interview with Lehman. I think we discussed it. I don't recall if we did, but it certainly was something that I was speaking about with other people, which is that there was this conflation at that time, and I suppose there still is, but I think, Hashgraph's imprint, the time that you guys have spent sort of in the public eye has helped to change this perception, but distributed ledgers were synonymous with blockchain. And blockchain is a database architecture, and it's not synonymous with DLT. It's not synonymous with a public ledger. And so I think that is kind of what you're getting at in a sense, that this is how it works. The open source architecture the blockchain as the database structure, the way that consensus happens. The real debate was, do we have to stick at proof of work or can we move to proof of stake, things like that. And all the limitations around the scalability were really thought about in terms of blockchain, which is very different architecturally.
Yep, you're completely right. And you hit on something else, which was another area that I think people focused on, which was not being open source. And that continues to be something that we need to explain more fully. I think the knee-jerk reaction is if you are not open source, you are then trying to capture all of the value and you're trying to mask what you've done and hide it. And, once you actually explain that you are going to release all of the code and actually publish it so people can see it and you're being very transparent about it, you just don't want to have authorized forks. That sort of takes the wind out of the sails of most of the open source kind of criticisms, I would say. But there still were people who just had a very clear, bright line, not open source, not investing. And that's fine. You need to have some rules. But that was something else I think was those rules and that philosophy wasn't designed for a group that actually was going to release all of the code so it would actually be visible to everybody else.
Well, that's also one of the things that's so fun and exciting about the space, which is that the software doesn't operate. So Linux is open source, but the economics of building an open source operating system and profiting off that ecosystem are very different than doing that in a crypto space, right? Because with Linux, you're happy as developers to support Linux's blossoming as a completely open source and free software because you can make money. The vast majority of money is made on the applications that run on top of it and the services and things like that. In this case, the big money is in the base protocol. And so there's an incentive to constantly fork, which is the issue of governance, which is, I think, has been early on a big part of your concerns. Granted, I'm sure Lehman hasn't said this to me, but I would imagine if I were Lehman that I would also want to have one good shot from a personal standpoint, from an ego personal standpoint. I would want to have a good shot at building out my vision, right? And ultimately, the patent doesn't protect you guys from having some company rip you off in China or whatever.
Correct.
But I mean, it's really about having control and being able to execute what you want to execute and do it effectively.
Yeah, I mean, and that is the case. And I think that Lehman has a technical roadmap plan. And he is a perfectionist, and he has this all architected, and he wants to implement that. And I think we were going to add the most value to the world by following his plan for the foreseeable future. And I think people will rip it off and will try to copy it. We've seen some of that happen already. I think they're going to find it's much harder to do this than it seems. And to your point, I think I've read that there have been 44 forks of Bitcoin, which is just, remarkable. And of those, I don't know how many we could even name right now, maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5.
The most prominent, obviously, is Bitcoin Cash.
Correct. Exactly. And there's Bitcoin Gold, and, there's a handful of others, but there's Bitcoin Pizza.
You could say Ethereum's a fork. In a sense, you could say all these are forks, really, of the original protocol. I mean, they're not forks, but
Ethereum, but there's a long, long list.
Right. Yeah, I meant that liberally. My point being that they're sort of attempts to build off that same, all that was available. But yes, I mean, that's a good point. But speaking to that, because one of the things people ask me, I meet with people all the time, and people ask me about Hashgraph. They ask me, they're fascinated by the technology. They're interested in Lehman. They're interested in learning more about Lehman always. That's like a big question. They always want to know. One of the questions is he the real deal, or is it real? What's he like? And what's really also, I should say, I think to me, what's most fascinating about Lehman, and I think this is what people are reacting to when they ask about him, is that it's rare, and I've met with many brilliant engineers, it's rare to meet a brilliant engineer who has that type of brain, but who also has not just the explanatory power that Lehman has, because he's so articulate, but also when you get to know Lehman, he's a very heart-centered person. He's very embodied. He's not just this detached brain, which is what makes him, I think, really compelling and interesting. But one of the things that I think comes up more and more in my discussions with people is, do I think, or do they think, or is there going to be one distributed ledger, one DLT that's going to win, or are there going to be sort of numerous? And that's emerging as one of the questions that a lot of investors are asking. And I think the case for numerous, for example, would be that there are going to be people, let's say the Wozniaks, that want to tinker, right? Versus the Steve Jobs who want the integrated, or the mass consumer sort of, who wants the integrated computer, doesn't want to fiddle with it, etc. Do you think that that's the case?
Yeah, 100% agreed. We certainly don't think that one ledger will win. We think there's room for multiple, whether they're directed acyclic graphs, whether they're blockchains. We think there's multiple. For example, I see Bitcoin going nowhere. Bitcoin, I don't think is going to be disintermediated. I think that's going to be around for a long time. And I can see other protocols also existing for a long time as well. And I think they will continue to evolve. So I don't see any one of us winning, but I do suspect what you generally see in tech is the top 2 or 3 companies take a big proportion of the market share, and then the rest of it is split between a large number of much smaller firms. And that wouldn't surprise me to see it here. I don't think you're going to see, and then again, this is just looking at other technology kind of development over time, where you see 2 or 3 companies take 80% of it, and then the rest over the bottom 20%. And that wouldn't surprise me if that it sort of falls in that sort of order of magnitude distribution at some point.
Something I wanted to ask you before I forget, this kind of circles back. It doesn't really follow with the flow of this particular point, but it has to do with investors. When you're speaking with investors, one of the things I think that is challenging for people who have spent a lot of time investing in this space, what you tend to find, I think particularly among investment crypto funds or investment shops that are sort of built around this industry, they have a thesis that they've developed that's very focused on blockchain. And they've made a lot of bets on companies that are sort of going to build out the layers based on this database architecture. And I think that is investing in Hashgraph, I would imagine for them, would be challenging. And for those who I've spoken to, I think that, though they haven't said it, I think it's sort of unspoken that it's a challenge for them. It kind of gets back to the original point about having learned this ecosystem in a particular way, learned about it as sort of blockchain equals distributed ledger technology. And that's challenging for them to get their heads around because they'd have to adjust their portfolios in such a way that it's problematic.
Yeah, it kind of disrupts some of the way they've understood the universe to work and how they understood the technology to work. Mm-hmm. And it questions some of the basic premises, I think, of what's possible. The question I get all the time is, well, if you're fast, aren't there security trade-offs? And the answer for us is no. Or they'll say, what is the trade-off? And, again and again, I have to say, I know this sounds improbable, but in fact, there aren't. And I can explain to you why that's actually the case. But everyone is conditioned to see security and speed as being opposing and a zero-sum game, which Lehman has proved doesn't have to be the case.
It's so fascinating that you say that. We don't get to speak that often. We've had a few sort of long conversations, but none of them have been in person. They've usually been like on car rides when I'm on the phone or you're on the phone. And I've had this conversation. I don't think I've told you this. I've had this conversation with a number of very smart people, and one in particular that comes to mind, it was one of these 2 individuals, and he said, there's always a trade-off. What's the trade-off? And I go, you're thinking about it in the wrong way. That's like saying, I have a faster horse than yours, so what's the trade-off? Like, okay, the trade-off is like, we have to have better hooves, or like his hooves deteriorate or whatever. That you're thinking about it as if it's the same thing, and it's not. So therefore, thinking about it in terms of trade-offs is wrong because you're shifting the graph. As opposed to moving along the graph, you're shifting it. You're looking at something totally different. And I think that is consistently a challenge I run into with people. And it was, for a long time, I was constantly trying to pinch myself, but what is wrong with me? We've had this conversation before. Like, now I've just accepted that, like, what? Maybe I'm right on this, maybe I'm not what I see, but I see what I see, I understand what I understand, and I did my best with the coverage of this technology to the audience to give them all the information I had, and let people make up their own mind. And I try to do the same thing with everyone else we have on. And I want to have everyone on I can possibly have who are the smartest people in this space. We've got a few great people coming up on the show who work in blockchain, and people have their own opinions. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't think, unfortunately for you and for me, I don't think that question is going to end anytime soon. I think it will continue.
So another thing before we cap off the specific architecture stuff, because then I want to get into distributed applications and what you're seeing there, because that's really cool. We haven't had a chance to talk about that much. Not in this conversation, not ever. The difference between DAGs and blockchains and chains, right, is actually significant. Irrespective of your original point that those guys out in the West Coast, whoever they were, who said, we're not bullish on DAGs, obviously that misses the point of what makes you guys unique. But separate from that whole conversation, DAGs allow for things that blockchains simply don't. And there are many use cases that a blockchain will never be able to do without the ability to, most importantly, order transactions.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
What do you think about that, and what level of use cases? And one more thing, when you answer that question, who do you think are going to be the early adopters of this network, the use cases?
So I think that probably one of the more compelling attributes of the technology is its cheapness, and it's cheap because it uses very little data, which makes it fast. So they're all sort of circular, they're all sort of related and integrated into the same component to it. We think a cryptocurrency transaction on our ledger takes about 100 bytes. So that means it's hard to measure what that cost is. We think it's in the millionths of a penny. I don't know what the price will be. Maybe it's a thousandth of a penny. That they haven't set that up yet. But that allows for native micropayment transactions. You don't need side chains. You don't need child chains. You don't need state channels. It can be on graph. And so we think the opportunity for native micropayments is just enormous. And it's obviously IoT use cases are enormous for that. We also see potential use cases for media and for paying for, this has not happened imminently, but you could have a browser that automatically pays up to 1/100th of a penny per website, for example. And so something that I think is critical to this is Lehman's original vision, which is the internet should be free and transparent and private, and that you shouldn't be the product.
You shouldn't be the cattle.
Right. And, that's a really critical thing. There's actually a book I'm reading. I don't know if you've read George Gilder's new book. It just came out.
What's it called?
It's called After Google, like the death of big data and the rise of blockchain. And he talks about how we are effectively the product. And, Anson Lehman talk about surveillance capitalism. And so...
Well, the shit that happened with Facebook recently,
right, So we don't know exactly when and how this evolution will shift, but one of Lehman's key points is building an internet where you can control your identity. And identity is critical. Once you get your identity, then that allows, and you control it, then that allows you to access and to interact in a way that is free from unwanted advertising. Now, maybe you can get it if you opt into it, but that it won't be a fundamental part of business models unless you deliberately want it. And that's a very big shift from where the internet is today.
Well, both Mance and Lehman did a lot of work in identity before this, right? I mean, Mance's company was Ping Identity.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I know Lehman spent a lot of time thinking about it. Isn't there a component of Hedera Hashgraph that has to do with forward thinking about controlling your identity?
Well, what you might be thinking about is sort of
KYC,
something
maybe?
we call like opt-in identity escrow, where
right.
it gives every wallet the ability to de-anonymize transaction by transaction or jurisdiction by jurisdiction at the option of the user. So you can keep an anonymous wallet if you want, but if you have to transact in a particular jurisdiction which requires X, Y, and Z, you can go to a certificate authority or whatever agency you need to, and that gives you a code once you're known who you are, and then you are de-anonymized for whatever those transactions are. And so that's a way to, again, keep identity in the hands of the user and allow them to de-anonymize at their will.
I think that also speaks to your approach. I think you guys have been trying to walk this line as effective as you can, right? Between giving the user as much privacy and autonomy and freedom as possible, but not so much so that it would collapse the function, that the government would step in and say, this is just done. We're not going to do this. We're not going to allow it at all, right? And I think to that particular feature that you're describing, it would allow someone to de-anonymize the data in situations where they need to, for example, like if they need to actually prove who they are or what the transaction is or something.
Yeah, and what you wouldn't want is to, and this comes to sort of the fact of trying to be effectively go to being a full stack provider. But what it effectively does is allows that functionality built in rather than having to go to another application to do that if it's required, which inevitably we think it will eventually in some jurisdictions. And so this just allows more broader uses to happen natively on the protocol.
And this also feeds back again originally to the other question about will there be multiple chains or multiple ledgers. There are many people that may not want that. Maybe they're going to want to be on a different distributed ledger technology. So,
but they could also just remain anonymous.
No, exactly. Well, I don't mean that particular. Yeah, you're right. So not maybe that particular thing, but the point is that there is a case for optionality. But then that goes to the point of who do you think are going to be the biggest beneficiaries of your technology? Let's assume that it works, right? Let's assume you guys are able to come out of the gate.
Knocking on wood, but I'm confident, yeah.
No, I understand. But it's always, you always have to make that point until it's out there and it's functioning in the wild and it's working, right? So who do you think are going to be the biggest initial beneficiaries and adopters of it? Let's say users, and then also maybe developers, and that'll give us a chance to get into application development.
I think that the large businesses that are joining the council are going to be very big users of this, but they will not be users of this till 2019 or 20 or 21. And so, we're in discussions with
these
some...
are like multinational.
These are the multinationals. And so one of these businesses came to me and said that they themselves think the applications of their business are about 100,000 TPS. Because of all the different projects.
Transactions per second.
Exactly, because of all the different things they're working on. Just that one company thinks that they may have that level of volume of transactions across all their manufacturing, all their banking. It's a very large business. So I think that's where a lot of transactions come from and a lot of uses come from down the road. But that's not the next 6 months. That's not the next year. That's probably 2 years from now. So right now, our focus and the interest is on a wide number of dApps and developers who, some of whom have found us and they've built on other platforms which they've been unhappy with and want to shift over to us. Others are people who've raised money and are looking for a scalable solution. Others who are just at the very beginning and contemplating where to build. So it's kind of everything from people who actually actively want to shift. And in fact, I think one of the most well-known applications on a well-known ledger supposedly is interested in potentially shifting to us, which would be a very big announcement if that happened. But it's a wide range. And you ask about applications. I mean, we've got 100, 200 groups that we're in active discussions with. We've built a developer advocate team that spans, 3 or 4 continents right now. That's something we continue to add to. And so the real focus of the company now is both on the technology side is one focus, obviously getting that ready is a priority number one. Building and executing the council is the other, and that's going very well. And that I hope we'll be able to make announcements in the next sort of, in September about that. We'll see. And then the third area, if you leave aside financing for a second, is on dApps and getting dApps on the network. And so we've got about a dozen or so who have actually signed MOUs and we've announced. We think that once we actually have the network launched and people can test it and see it, I think that number is going to go up dramatically. And so we plan to have our public APIs ready in the next, month or so, and then gradually launch the network and gradually open it up for dApps to begin building on us. And we'll be testing it and gradually opening it for 6 months after we launch it. That period of time, I think we'll see the level of interest increase significantly as the performance of the network, I think, is tested and visible for everyone to see.
Walk us through the timeline, actually. I'm curious, and I think that'll be helpful for the audience. What are the important milestones going forward, and when do you think approximately those dates will be, if you can give us those dates?
Yeah, I want to stay away from specific dates just because it's technology and things are always in flux. But I mean, I think we're getting pretty close with the public APIs, and so I'd hope to be able to launch the network in the next couple of months.
And that'll allow anyone who wants to build on it to build on it.
We won't, yes, except that we're not going to release them broadly yet.
Right.
And so over a 6-month period from when we launch the network, we're going to release the APIs on a gradual basis, developer and dApp by dApp, and with an ever-increasing rate as the network shows it's able to handle it. And then 6 months after we launch the network, we think it'd probably be in good enough place to just have complete broad release availability for anyone to build on it.
Yeah, and to be clear, there is no license to build on Hedera.
Right. You don't even have to
anyone
talk to
who
us,
wants to build on it can build on it.
Correct. The other thing I should say, which I should have mentioned earlier on, but this is part of this whole schedule here, is that we're also going to be enlisting the community, both developers as well as just community members, to help test the network and build on it. And so once we've launched it, we're putting together a testing program where community members will be rewarded for testing it and developers will be rewarded for building on it. And we hope that should be ready to go, I think, in the fall.
That's cool.
Which would be, I think it's an important thing that we do, and it's a way to get people really involved.
Who aren't necessarily accredited investors, finally, to be able to
and it's for people who are or aren't. It's, we're sort of indifferent to that, but it's a way to get everybody involved in helping the network. Yeah.
So, not to hold your feet to the fire on a date, but if you were being optimistic, when would you hope that, let's say, you'd be able to be at a place where it's fully open?
I mean, I think that'll be first half of next year.
First half of next year. That's nice.
And I think that you
pretty
will
ambitious.
see real progress and real announcements prior to that. The timeline also, as I mentioned, APIs in development, hope to be able to launch the network in the next couple of months. We then will probably do the community testing program sometime in the fall. There'll be dApps kind of steadily building us over this time. We also have Hedera 18 coming up in Dallas, October 15 to 17, and that's our first developer conference. And so we're very excited about that. That's a multi-day conference. We're going to have, obviously, the whole team is going to be presenting. Lehman is going to be giving a variety of talks. We're going to have people who are building on us give discussions. We're doing a global hackathon in, I think it's 7 cities around the world at the same time, sort of simultaneously. And we'll have some of the largest companies, some of the potential council members also be speaking about what they're doing. So I think it's going to be a very significant event to show the level of involvement across different factors of the community.
What use cases are you most excited about? And not just in general terms, but specifically that you think and hope will migrate over to Hashgraph in the next year?
I mean, listen, there's so many different ones. I mean, I think decentralized exchanges are something super interesting.
It brings us back to the directed acyclic graph.
Yep. I mean,
fair ordering.
Fair ordering is really important. I think there are some, exciting projects talking to us in that area. Something that I love, and it's not, just to be clear, it's not being built on us yet, but there are potentials for decentralized versions of some of the most common applications that we know, like Uber, like Airbnb, et cetera. And so I'd love to see, I think there's a test pilot for the decentralized Uber happening in Auckland, but that's not built on us, to be clear. But I think that type of thing that effectively could and we're well suited for, that I get very excited about. And I basically think that there's applications for validating and sharing medical credentials across jurisdictions. I think that could be incredibly helpful to people, but it's not going to be as widely used and it's not as sort of sexy as some of the other ones, but it's still helpful. There's chat applications that, incorporate all the different chats you have on your phone already. There's too many to even talk about.
That brings us to the question of how do you, as an investor, think about this space and what are you looking for, right? I mean, that's something I ask myself. And the way I see it, there are 3 types of applications that I see, right? One is the one where it's just like, we're just going to build on our blockchain. So it just sounds sexy and it sounds interesting. We can just raise some money. Total bullshit. Totally useless. You would never invest in it. Then you got the cases like Uber that you're talking about where they look at the server side equation and they say, or the middleman equation, and they say, okay, how do we cut out costs so that we make this operation more profitable, right? And those are great and very interesting. And, if they're good, they're worth investing in. And then I think the optimal investment is the one where the technology makes possible a use case that wasn't previously available, right? And those are the most interesting. And those, I think, as an investor, they offer one the opportunity to be most creative and to be challenged, right? To find something really unique.
Yep. And listen, that is something that I couldn't agree with you more. And it's almost like thinking about the internet back in 1990. There were 10 websites. Now there are 1.9 billion. And the interesting thing is the average of the top 20 most visited websites right now, the average start date of those was, I think, July of 2002. Why 2002? There's no special reason, but 99 is when broadband became widely available. And so I think that bringing this capacity will help accelerate use cases that weren't even possible back when blockchain was first conceived. And so when the internet started, no one thought about the use cases that we just mentioned. No one thought about Airbnb. No one thought about YouTube. It wasn't even possible. Couldn't even conceptualize that back then. And so I agree with you in terms of the type of application to be most compelling. I have trouble imagining what some of those might be at this early stage. Mm-hmm. But the other thing we're doing is we are going to launch an ecosystem fund that is going to invest in some of the applications building our network that we find most compelling. And so that's sort of the next sort of step in our evolution so that we and some of our partners can help these businesses in terms of financing and also take advantage of the access that we have to some of these great businesses.
That makes sense. I mean, that sounds very exciting. I wonder if 2002 is not because it coincided with cheaper bandwidth, because there was all this dark bandwidth that was built out and then there was the market crash.
It's using that bandwidth, which it's a combination of both. It's broadband being available, whether it's, DSL cable modems, T1s, et cetera. It certainly couldn't have happened with just 56K.
Tom, it was great having you on, man. This was totally, all I had here was a little notepad with my pencil, and I was literally just writing it down as we were talking. I normally have giant notes, but this was a last-minute thing. You came through. It's great having you on, man.
Listen, thank you for having me. It's great to see you, and it's really fun and appreciate your support.
Yeah, no,
So
I wish you the best of luck in your travels. Where are you going next?
I am headed to Europe next, and then then there might be a trip to Australia in the fall.
What are you doing on all
We'll
these
see.
trips? Are you working, or is this?
Yeah,
like...
I mean, these trips are a combination of everything. I mean, we'll be meeting both investors, meeting exchanges, meeting council members, doing meetups, meeting the community. There is just it's a global business. And so every dimension of this business is global and is happening everywhere. So, you wake up on the phone, you go to bed on the phone because there's always time zones that you need to talk to. And so I've been around the world twice since March, taking it a little bit easier right now as we do this crowd sale, so staying local for a little while, but then there's a lot of pent-up meetings to be had.
And Lehman, for the most part, is in Dallas.
Yes, it has to be extraordinarily important to get Lehman to leave. We need him there and focused, and I think, he's very happy to be there and to be as not distracted as possible. The one thing I should say that I didn't get a chance to is the unique thing you mentioned, Lehman and Manson. At one point, the lucky piece here is they are both professors, and so they're technologists first and foremost, but they were both taught for years, and so working with them is effectively like being in school. And that's why it's so easy for you and also for me to interact, because they're accustomed to teaching. And Lehman loves telling people and educating them on what he's doing and why it's important, what his vision is, and even getting to very technical details. And he has so much patience for it. Mm-hmm. And so that is, I think, not a characteristic common among many entrepreneurs.
He loves it.
Yeah, he loves it. And that is a real...
My engineer is laughing here because he's had the privilege also of having been a part of all of this from the beginning. He's had a chance to listen to all these interviews, right? And it's quite a journey. I mean, I actually was speaking to a bunch of other entrepreneurs who are doing their own thing. They're based out of California. They were here like a week ago and they asked to meet with me, and I was speaking with them. They asked about Lehman. And I said, one of the things that differentiates Lehman from other people is, let's say you say to Lehman, this seems very challenging for you to do this, but it's enormously challenging. That's why it's fun.
Yes. Exactly right. Right.
All right. Well, best of luck. And again, thanks for coming on.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot, Demetri. Appreciate it.
And that was my episode with Tom Trowbridge. I want to thank Tom for being on my program. For more information about today's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you're a regular listener to the show, take a moment to review us on Apple Podcasts. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.